We'll start today's conversation with an iWest overview to provide context on where we started the effort and how initial phase one focus has been compiled into a comprehensive report. We'll conduct a series of focused panel discussions where we will engage in conversation aligned with our key findings and observations associated again with the phase one report. And we'll close out the event with a discussion on the next steps for iWest as we look forward to phase two. Next slide, please. The goal of iWest is to develop a regional roadmap for carbon neutrality for the Intermountain West region, represented by the 6 states that you see on the left-hand side. These states were picked for a variety of critical reasons, including shared geographical, environmental, and demographic attributes. They're all characterized by fossil fuel-based economies and share challenges related to climate and climate change. And they're positioned to emerge as leaders in new energy economies. Next slide, please. In phase one of iWest, we started to explore symbiotic economies like the graphic on the right-hand side, where we see hydrogen, bioenergy, CO2, and electricity as symbiotic economies that are essential to energy transition within the region. And the pathways that we're discussing in terms of energy transition must be focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and must be sustainable. And we're really looking at these symbiotic economies through the lens of how we can leverage them to decarbonize critical energy sectors and create supply and demand scenarios for new industries. Next slide, please. And we're really focused on building regional coalitions as a critical outcome of iWest in order to address acceptance of emerging energy technologies in order to enhance chances of their regional adoption. And successful energy transition strategies depend on effective planning and implementation at the local level. We've adopted a place-based approach that engages regional stakeholders and thought leaders to assess critical details like societal readiness in tandem with technical readiness. We're explicitly considering policy, revenue and jobs, workforce equity, and energy, environmental, and social justice factors in our phase one thought processes. And regional coalitions are critical to roadmap implementation and technology deployment. Next slide, please. So a key outcome of iWest phase one is our phase one report, which you can find on our iwest.org website. This report was assembled by the highly talented team that you see on the right-hand side, and you'll hear from a number of our team members for phase one throughout our panel discussions that we have planned for the remainder of our webinar. And if you have questions as we go through the various panel discussions, please enter them into the chat or email them to us at iwest@lanl.gov, and we'll address them offline. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Alicia for our first panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Before we start asking questions of our illustrious panel, we'll start by introducing them and then giving you just some high-level findings as a result of phase one iWest. On the panel today is Rajesh Pawar from Los Alamos National Labs, Raina Ehrenfeucht of University of New Mexico, Alan Krupnick from Resources for the Future, Janie Chermak from University of New Mexico, and Robert Page with Arizona State University. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is a very high-level overview of the findings of the report. But at the onset of this project, organizers wisely adopted a place-based approach. And while each of the regions within the neighboring 6 states share some similarities, they're also very unique in each of their areas. A one-size-fits-all top-down approach most likely would not have discovered the best solution, nor would it necessarily be accepted by the communities where they were going to be employed. Each community, its resources, and its history is unique and deserves to be heard and respected. As the energy industry continues to evolve, policies to support emerging opportunities must be put into place. Timely forward movement will require coalitions and consensus, uniting them in the request of state and federal agencies. Next slide, please. The transition in energy has already and will continue to impact the varying economies of each region and its unique workforce. Generally, people live where they want to live, and they've been able to do that and support their families. So as to avoid upending families and leaving others behind in poverty, new jobs in new energy-related fields need to be created timely, and they are there to backfill jobs lost already and jobs that will be lost in the future. Energy workers are capable of upskilling, and they will continue to rely on their community colleges and universities in their region. And finally, as this energy transition moves forward, it must include equitable opportunities for affected communities. Communication, collaboration, and consensus will only benefit everyone. Next slide. So we're going to start with Raj, and I have a question for you. Are you ready, Raj?
Yes, go ahead.
Why was a place-based approach so important for the iWest initiative?
All right. So as you mentioned, Alicia, there is increased recognition that place-based approaches can be really effective for both quicker adoption of new technologies and also their long-term sustainability, as well as acceptance by local communities where the technologies are deployed. At the heart of it, a place-based approach takes into account both the geographical factors as well as the regional and local societal factors when determining effective regional strategies that can succeed in the long term and would have wider stakeholder support. So iWest is a unique region in that while there are shared attributes, there is also diversity on multiple fronts, including the types of energy resources that are available in the region, which range from fossil fuels to renewables to bio-based resources. There are multiple suitable geologic formations that have capacity that is needed for subsurface storage for both carbon dioxide as well as hydrogen. There is also existing infrastructure that includes plants, transmission lines, pipelines that can be potentially repurposed. Also from a resource perspective, there is an important resource, which is water. And vast portions of iWest region are seeing the effects of climate change right now, including long-lasting and severe droughts, which has impacted water availability. And that water is needed for various competing needs, which has to be taken into account for energy technologies that require water. So all of these factors affect determining what types of energy technologies can be effectively deployed and where. On the societal side, there is significant diversity in the demographics of the people, as well as communities, which include a mix of rural and urban communities. It also has, the region has largest concentration of Native American tribes and diversity in terms of both economically advanced as well as disadvantaged communities. There are differences of opinion throughout the region on what type of energy technologies should be used and why. And these differences have to be taken into consideration when generating wider stakeholder support. So given that there are all these kind of issues that have to be considered, a place-based approach had to be, is the one that we think would be effective to accelerate the deployment that is needed.
Very good. Well, before I let you go, Raj, let me ask you one other question. One of the key findings in the final report is that there are various motivations for energy transition. Describe some of those motivations and how iWest balanced those competing priorities.
Sure. So during phase one, what we did was we organized 8 different workshops throughout the region with the help of our partners. These workshops included one workshop that is dedicated to get inputs from the tribal region, and then others were to get input from general public. And the objectives were to hear from the public about their expectations, their needs, and concerns about energy transition and new energy technologies. So these workshops gave us a lot of useful information about the way people are viewing at energy transition. One of the important factors that community members say will affect their support of projects is the level of investments that made locally. The stakeholders want to see a level of permanence in terms of how a project lasts, so that the economic impact is long lasting, and it also can help sustain the community financially. There are also differences in understandings of what an energy transition would look like. There are communities where generations have been dependent on fossil fuels, as you mentioned, and that view fossil fuels as part of their identity. But they do see that there is increasing demand for decarbonization and cleaner energy alternatives, both regionally and nationally. And they see the importance of implementing policies and technologies as a means for diversifying and in some cases, revitalizing local economies. There are others who think that energy transition is more in line with mitigating the effects of climate change and achieving carbon neutrality. And so balancing these competing views is a challenge. But what we think is ultimately an effective approach will be the one that includes assessment of economic, environmental, and workforce impacts in general. And the likelihood of acceptance of technologies is high if those assessments show that there is equitable economic opportunities for an entire community. There may be wariness in the region in terms of newer technologies given past experiences, but overall the communities do understand the importance in terms of decarbonization, and they don't want to get left behind compared to other regions as they continue to evolve, innovate, and adopt newer technologies.
Thank you, Raj.
Yep.
Raina, are you ready for a question? All right. The iWest report suggests that there will be trade-offs between addressing EESJ and reaching decarbonization goals on an accelerated timeline. What are some of those trade-offs, and how can the region strike a balance?
Well, one goal of furthering energy, environmental, and social justice is to ensure that both opportunities and potential harms are distributed equitably. But the more difficult dimensions are developing the common goals and governance that reflects multiple priorities and worldviews, and Raj kind of pointed to that. Tribal governments in our region are rights holders, and so they're rights holders in all discussions that occur. But in addition to these governments, diverse communities have claims to influence actions that will impact them and to have their priorities and values reflected in decisions and energy transition pathways. The reality was that past energy production sacrificed some people's communities, their health, the places, the lands they valued. And that was for the benefit of others, and sometimes some local benefits, sometimes very few. But in iWest's place-based approach, there are no sacrifice zones. And instead, the new energy landscapes opportunities and opportunities need to be equitable and available. And of course, reducing potential harm and eliminating it whenever possible. But nevertheless, the most significant trade-off may be the pace of the transition. The urgency of moving to carbon neutrality, including the policy and funding that's already in place and moving forward, do not have consensus among iWest states and indigenous nations, let alone the diverse communities within them. The pace of change is misaligned with the pace of building these sustaining partnerships and relationships. And it's misaligned with incorporating diverse values and worldviews as we set priorities. So we want to move into a very different direction, but we need to do it quickly. But to do something really different, we need to build these relationships that take a lot of time. So even popular technology such as solar can face resistance when the discussion shifts from technology to the location of a specific facility. But really what this trade-off speaks to is the ongoing importance of governance alongside the development and deployment of technologies and the economics. And to strike a balance, we need to continuously improve the governance processes as we seek to meet these other goals. And on that, I'll pass it back to you, Alicia.
Very well said. Thank you. All right, Janie, we're going to move over to you. Are you ready?
I am.
What was the one most surprising economic factor you discovered through your assessment?
Alicia, that's a really good question. And I think Raj and Renya actually set this up beautifully. We have to look at these states and the counties and the communities within them and recognize how important they are to the energy landscape in the United States. They are energy exporters. Those communities get their identity, a lot of them long-term, from being an energy community. And yet they still understand that there is a move going forward and recognize the importance at a global level, I think, of combating climate change. So I think one of the things that was most important to me to understand better, or most surprising perhaps, is the resilience of these communities, quite frankly. If you look at these communities that are long-term energy producers, they are boom and bust communities. And by that, I mean, when energy is high, those communities are doing great. When energy is low in price, those communities are not doing well. And yet they are resilient, they keep coming back, and they are interested in moving forward in this transition, in incorporating new types of projects and new energy projects into their communities. But saying that, there are consistencies and there are uniquenesses across them. Almost every community and every group that we spoke with, jobs are important, but it's not a job that takes you out of town, it's a job in my community. But it's also the speed with which those jobs come about, because if we have a lag, you lose the community. It's different for every community, I think, except I think this is the first time that, we've really looked across this and said, place-based is so important. And place-based is important, not just for the technology, but for, will the community accept it? How does the community work with that? And what's the transition and how do they go forward? They're very resilient in that. And from an economic perspective of moving and economic development, that's an important piece of it. The other thing that I will say, and then I'll end on this, is the fact that it's not just communities that currently have energy projects. There are communities that look at this as a way forward to improve their economic development as well. And so there's an embracing of this transition, but I think we have to be cognizant of missteps in the past, impacts of communities in the past, as Renya has talked about, and how do you incorporate technology to move forward at the global level, but to really keep it at the level of recognizing it is place-based and community-oriented. And I'll pass it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Janie. You did a great job of describing energy-based communities living in one, by the way. All right, Alan, we're going to move on to you. Based on your findings, is the policy landscape in the region and federal government favorable to the energy transition?
Well, that's a big question. We did look at state policies in detail and federal policies in detail in the report. And of course, the big news is the federal landscape has dramatically changed. There are open-ended programs for tax credits for carbon capture, utilization and storage, and hydrogen and direct air capture. There's money for green transport, renewables, advanced manufacturing, decarbonization, hydrogen hubs, and many other components of the carbon and hydrogen and biofuels pathways that we're all about here in iWest. So we're going to be moving down these pathways on the backs of these programs, as well as what the state is doing, as well as So for instance, one good example is in electricity because of um, what's called the 48Q carbon capture utilization and storage tax credit. There's modeling that suggests that all or most coal plants in the United States, including the I-West region, would have CCUS on them, carbon capture on them by 2035. So that's a major transformation of the electricity sector. And of course, there are already a number of CCUS and hydrogen projects in the I-West pipeline, even before the two key pieces of federal legislation were passed. And one that really catches my eye is in Arizona, where there's a $1 billion hydrogen-fueled semi-truck plant that's going to be constructed. So with that, you will have off-takers for hydrogen produced, whether it's through the hubs or not. So this is very important for building the hydrogen economy in the region. As DOE would say, the region is ready for liftoff. That said, the I-West states, I think, as you've already heard, are quite different from one another, basically on their energy dependency or independence and their culture. So, for instance, not all states are fully on board with roadmaps, decarbonization roadmaps, and some states are. So, and those states that are not also favor small government with less regulation. And let's face it, these transitions need a regulatory strategy, right? Regulatory strategies to really take off for the liftoff. So, but those kind of states would favor carbon capture and blue hydrogen because it keeps up natural gas demand. We haven't talked too much about tribes. Others will, but they're very different from one another and can't be generalized about. And finally, key challenges that we see for policy to deal with are the job transitions, pipeline siting, and technology for pipelines. Permitting is a huge issue that needs attention. The lack of regulatory clarity over storage liability, for instance, the balkanization of the grid. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And as Renia mentioned, environmental justice considerations. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, Bob, we saved the best for last. Are you ready for your question? Okay, here we go. Which decarbonization pathways explored by I-West are most promising in terms of transitional workforce opportunities for the region?
So I don't think we know yet which of the pathways are winners in this. I think that there are going to be a number of pathways that emerge, a number of new projects, and many of those are going to be good for the transition workforce. This will be a very large effort. There'll be a range of new occupations coming from this, everything from sociologists to engineers, and from craft to PhDs. The transition over the next 5 to 10 years probably will focus on the electric grid, new renewable power generation, pipelines tied probably to hydrogen, maybe CO2, capture and storage, hydrogen production itself, a lot of research and education. During the transition, future jobs and new jobs are going to grow fairly rapidly. Our research and our dialogue with industry indicated that there is a dearth of available candidates for the jobs that industry believes that they are introducing or will introduce shortly. The case studies that are coming up next from Wyoming and San Juan College clearly indicate the kind of transitional workforce that already exists in this region. And that then feeds into this need. So in closing, I think it's a story of opportunity if we look at jobs, whether transition or new ones that need to be developed through education and training. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you for setting up Selena on her workforce case study. which is up next. Is that right, Kevin?
That's right. Go ahead, Selena.
Thank you. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Kevin. My name is Selena. I'm with the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a case study that we did for iWest Phase 1 on developing critical mineral industries in the Powder River Basin. So we can go ahead and go to that next slide. Thank you. So we were evaluating what are the workforce opportunities, what are the requirements for developing these critical mineral industries in the Powder River Basin where there are large coal reserves that critical minerals can be developed out of. So we're going to talk about those opportunities, the requirements, and then the training and education that will be needed. Next slide, please. So there are huge opportunities to develop this industry in the Powder River Basin. So this is up in northeastern Wyoming and southern Montana. There already are very generous coal reserves, some of the most generous in the country, and it's a top coal producing region. And this means that there is also already the infrastructure in place in terms of transportation, roads and railroads, transmission lines. The mines are there, as well as well-developed supply chains. It also means that there is already a trained workforce in the mining industry, as well as in other related industries, power plants, oil and gas extraction, and again, all of those supporting industries. Next slide, please. So we did an assessment of what the workforce requirements are going to be for developing these critical mineral industries and broke it up into these 3 categories. The first being exploration. So this is going to be exploring for where those reserves are, where the critical minerals can best be developed and extracted out of. So this is going to be largely geologists, different types of geologists, both in the field as well as geochemists and geophysicists. The next stage that we looked at is the mining stage. So this is actually extracting the carbon ore out of the ground, which is the industry that is already very well developed up in the Powder River Basin. So it's going to be a lot of the same skills that will be needed to do that phase of critical mineral development. There may be a need for more of specific types of these skill sets that are already available up there. This includes like mining engineers. The next phase that we looked at is the processing phase, and this is the phase that is going to be kind of the newest phase, and we broke it up into 2 different categories. So there is the phase of developing the procedures to do the extraction. So this is where you really extract those critical minerals out of the carbon ore. So to develop those practices, this is going to be more like chemical engineers and geochemists. And then the next phase is going to be really those day-to-day operations, operating these processing plants. And that's going to be a lot of trained operators, as well as a lot of lab technicians and maintenance personnel that will be needed to do those day-to-day operations. Let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. It's possible, depending on where the industry goes, that there will also be a need for new skills. But it's a little hard to tell right now exactly where some of these industries might be going. For example, if there ends up being a lot more autonomous vehicles and hybrids, that'll change the workforce requirements, needing expertise in those fields. There's a lot of potential for robotics to be used more widely in mining and sampling. As well as other types of automation and potentially biologically enabled solutions. So this is things like microbes being used for separation and processing. So that will also potentially change the skill sets that will be needed. And it's important to keep that in mind that these industries are all evolving. Next slide, please. So next we assessed what are the current training and educational options that are already available. And what we realized is we're going to be really looking at training that happens both at this like university level, as well as this more like community college level and vocational training level. So at the university level, this is going to be a lot of those processes for developing how to do the extraction. That's going to be that R&D work. as well as the more downstage, maybe like final processing, where you do the more fine scale processing and purification of the critical minerals. And that will require people with bachelor's, master's, and doctorate degrees. And again, this is going to be things like chemical engineers, mining engineers, geologists. And at that community college level, this will be more of that work that happens, those daily operations, the lab technicians, the mining, which our community colleges already, especially Gillette Community College already, has a lot of programs to train people for the mining industry. And then those more upstream parts of the processing as well. So this will be associate degrees and technical training, a lot of which, like I mentioned, Gillette College and other community colleges already offer a lot of this type of training. Next slide, please. We also inventoried what potential future programs could look like, including what, you know, our community colleges that are really already based up there could provide. And this includes expanding the programs that are being offered. For example, having an operators program, which is something Gillette College is already being really forward thinking and is working to develop an operators program that would train people to operate the different machinery that will be needed. It also looks like doing really innovative partnerships. These can be partnerships between the universities, the community colleges, as well as community spaces like maker spaces. So our makerspace here has what they call a badge program. And this involves a series of both hands-on and virtual trainings in modules that people can sign up to take, and it'll act like a certification. After they've taken it, they'll get a certification that says that they have a certain amount of knowledge and expertise in this field. And it's a way to give kind of an introductory or some specialty skill sets without it being a full degree program. So we are working on developing a sample of a program like this for critical minerals as part of one of our CourseEM grants that we're currently working on here at University of Wyoming. Next slide, please. Oh, and I guess that's actually it. So it is really important, I think, when we're thinking about these workforce requirements, that we do think about it in terms of the importance of it being really place-based. There will be actual people that are needed to do these industries, to do the work for these industries. And so it's important that we look at specific places in the region and what the workforce already looks like and what training is going to be needed. I'll turn it over to you, Alicia.
Thank you, that was great. So I'm going to take over and present the Four Corners Workforce Case Study. So for over 60 years, San Juan County, New Mexico has been home to 2 coal-fired power plants and associated coal mines. They have been economic engines for the region. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss their impacts and the effort to transition not only the workforce, but the community in general into other means of economic prosperity. We'll review their past contributions to the region, and you'll see that there is a large gap to fill, and it is a work in progress. I'm going to start by looking at each of the 2 generation facilities and their supporting mines. First slide, please. Going online in the 1970s, San Juan Generating Station and its associated San Juan Mine have employed literally generations of workers. At its peak, the mine and the plant supported approximately 1,800 people with high-wage careers. So in 2017, when P&M announced its intended closure of this facility last year in 2022, the college worked closely with P&M, Westmoreland Mines, and Four Corners Economic Development to paint a picture of the economic impact expected. Once this initial report was completed, the college then commissioned an independent third-party entity called Economic Modeling Specialists, Inc., to conduct its own impact report. They have the ability to estimate not only direct job losses and impact, but indirect and implied. So the data that I'm going to present in the upcoming slides pulls from both of these reports. Next slide, please. Here's a snapshot of the average worker at San Juan Generating Station and San Juan Mine in 2017. At that time, the average wage of an employee who had worked there loyally for 14 years was $86,000. The average age of that employee was 47 years old, and 96% of those employees relied upon their employer for their health care. 40% of the workforce was Native American. Next slide, please. The remaining coal-fired power plant and its associated mine came on earlier in the 1960s. It's located on tribal lands, and the vast majority of loyal workers are Native American. At its peak, Navajo Mine and Four Corners Power Plant employed almost 2,000 area residents. It's currently slated to close in 2031. Next slide, please. So you'll notice that the snapshot of a Four Corners Navajo Mine employee is very, very similar to the first. The way you'll notice the biggest difference is that 80% of that workforce is Native American. Next slide, please. These losses just reflect the impact suffered by the loss of San Juan Generating Station. So $57 million almost in lost wages, $20 million in benefits, almost 1,600 jobs. 5,000 area residents will be impacted, and the county stands to lose almost $4 million in tax revenue. Next slide, please. So we believe that economic prosperity starts with an education. So let's look at the impact on our K-12 systems in the county. I'd like to call your attention to two of the school districts. The first is Central Consolidated, where 91% of its student body is Native American, and 72% of the student body is deemed financially disadvantaged. They will lose, just in student funding, $1.5 million. In tax, like property tax revenue, they'll lose almost another $1 million. I'd also like to call to your attention the Bloomfield School District. And while they'll be impacted the least, 100% of their students are deemed financially disadvantaged. So any loss that they incur will definitely be felt. One other factoid I didn't put on this slide is that San Juan College will lose almost $2 million in property tax revenue. Next slide, please. So supporting San Juan Generating Station and San Juan Mine, workers came from a 6-county region. And you can see the impacts to those 6 counties, and this comes from the MC report. Loss in earnings, $117 million a year. The state of New Mexico will lose almost $21 million a year in tax revenue, and the total tax loss in the county will be $24 million. All right, next slide, please. So, as I said, there's a big gap to fill, and where does it start? With education. So San Juan College serves the Four Corners region primarily in Northwest New Mexico, and I want to tell you a little bit about it. It is a majority minority serving institution where 51% of its student body is either Native American or Hispanic. I serve at the School of Energy, and depending upon the year, our student body just in the School of Energy will vacillate a little bit between 65% and 68% either Native American or Hispanic. All right, next slide, please. So we got a start on it in 2015 when the college was awarded $1.4 million in retraining funds from the Power Grant, which was administered by the U.S. Economic Development Administration. The training for affected workers and their families would have to last less than 1 year. So we ultimately trained the bulk of those people in these 3 certificate programs. But we started by saying, before we put them in those programs, what skills do they bring to the plate? Next slide, please. So while we often hear it could be a challenge to retrain coal miners, we thought, well, let's take a look at the skills they bring. And I really want you to kind of notice these skills because we're going to see something very similar in a couple of slides from now. All right, next slide. So how did those workers do? Well, we trained 333 affected workers or family members. And you can see that 89.8% of those individuals completed one of our most difficult certificate programs. 8% of those participants were female, 45% of those participants were Native American. So graduates from our Instrumentation Controls and Electrical Technology program are prepared to enter high-wage careers in a wide variety of industries, including water treatment, pharmaceutical, aerospace, and yes, of course, energy. Moving on to the next slide, please. All right, remember those skills that we saw earlier? You're going to notice a definite overlap between those two slides. These are slides for a carbon capture technician. With pending projects perhaps coming to our area, we decided to look at those skills to see if perhaps we couldn't take alumni from the School of Energy, having trained generations of workers, as well as current and future students, and upskill them or offer advanced credentials that would allow them to work in the evolving industry. Next slide, please. So what are we doing about that? Well, we've been working with a couple of hydrogen-related entities, and in fact, in 2021, signed a memorandum of understanding with New Mexico-based on-site scalable hydrogen company called Biotech. They named us the training provider of choice. And with a congressional appropriation heading our way to develop a clean hydrogen technician advanced certificate program, we truly believe that we can take alumni as well as current and future students and make them ready to work when the work is available. To that end, we know that safety is going to be a big element of working in the hydrogen industry. And so I am glad to serve as the co-chair of the Education Committee for the Center for Hydrogen Safety. And with that, I think I'm through. Is that not correct? I think that is.
Thanks, Selena. Thanks, Alicia. And I think with this, we'll turn it over to Sheila to kick off our next panel discussion.
Great, thanks. And we're going to talk now about the bioenergy economy and have a discussion with Babs Maroney from Los Alamos, Raina Ehrenfort from UNM, University of New Mexico, Janie Chermak from University of New Mexico, and Bob Page from Arizona State. And so the bioeconomy is cross-cutting, and it encompasses multiple sectors representing the infrastructures, technologies, and processes that are needed to produce energy and products derived from biological resources such as plants and microorganisms. In the first phase of iWest, we explored how a regional bioeconomy can help reduce the dependence on fossil fuels, reduce carbon emissions, and generate less waste while driving new economic growth. The Intermountain West has an abundant biomass resource with the potential to increase the regional bioenergy economy, and iWest examined several technologies that can be used to convert these resources to energy. Our assessment investigated the potential benefits, including reduction of CO2 emissions that could be achieved by growing the bioenergy sector, as well as the challenges such as water scarcity and the projected impact of climate change on the availability of biomass resources in the region. So we're going to start our discussion, and Babs, I'm wondering if you can highlight some of the areas of the bioeconomy in the iWest region, including those that are of growing interest.
Certainly, Sheila. So there's great interest nationally in using non-food crops and other waste biomass or carbon sources as feedstocks for bioenergy or bioproducts. In our phase 1 study, we looked at using available non-food crops for electricity production or biopower and for ethanol production as a blend with gasoline, but also ethanol as a commodity chemical for other products and for example, sustainable aviation fuel or SAF. So food crop residues and all types of forest residues, woody biomass, are the most abundant biomass resources in the iWest. Utilizing these waste resources for electricity production in place of fossil fuels could reduce CO2 emissions in the region by 55% each year. Another opportunity is to exploit a natural synergy between agriculture and growth of purpose-grown and bioenergy crops or non-food crops such as microalgae or oilseed crops or switchgrass. Bioenergy crops can be grown on marginal lands and can utilize marginal or brackish water or oil and gas produced water, for example. So converting the bioenergy crops or crop or forest residues to fuels or power or other durable bioproducts creates byproducts that can be used as natural fertilizers too, for example, biochar, so that carbon and other nutrients can be returned to the soil. And we'd like to explore the synergies between bioenergy and agriculture further in phase 2.
Thanks, Babs. And so, Rania, as the region works to break into new and maybe these less familiar energy markets like bioenergy, what are a few recommendations from your iWest studies that project leaders should keep in mind?
Well, I think one important point points to Janie's earlier comment that jobs matter. They matter in the short run and in the long run. And so that is certainly a point of entry. The place-based approach is grounded in the strengths and histories of local communities as well as the region. And many communities within the iWest continue to be involved in agriculture, as Babs talked about, ranching, dairy. And these industries are also undergoing change. And in many cases, some operations have very, very slim profits. The unique potential in bioenergy, particularly if we focus on small-scale operations, is the possibility to add value to what might be waste products in these industries. And it can also tie to the actions underway to establish forest management practices that will reduce fire risk and lead to healthy forest ecosystems. And these can be jobs for people in rural communities that have different skills than described in the 2 case studies that we just heard about. And so it's a way that the energy transition can support different forms of livelihood and ways of living. And so 2 important considerations will be how to incentivize different scales of bioenergy operations over different geographic scales, as well as what initiatives can create the local capacity for people working in these other sectors to participate and benefit from the growth in bioenergy. The scale of production will matter in order to increase opportunities to grow jobs that will benefit people locally. They've already been impacted by economic change in many cases, but these are not people who traditionally have had jobs in the energy production. And so without explicit initiatives to achieve local benefits in this way, we could see systems and firms develop with the expertise to extract value from local areas, but not create as many local benefits. But the really exciting part is how this place-based approach can also support retaining this kind of diversity that people value within and among the communities throughout the iWest region. So I'll turn it back to you, Sheila.
Thanks, Rania. Janie, hi. Can you discuss a couple of economic factors associated with the new bioeconomy in this region, both in terms of opportunities and the risks?
Certainly, Sheila, and Babs and Rania set this up beautifully because they talked about a lot of this to start with. So I think one of the things about bioenergy that is most unique to me is the fact of the location. And it's different than other energy sources and projects and products that we've talked about in the iWest region. It really is tied to the density, the availability of the resource, as well as access. And so what that does is if we look at some of the places where there may be the highest potential from an economic perspective right now, they don't overlay with some of the more traditional energy projects that we've looked at. And so it encompasses a larger group or a different group, I think, of folks that we would be looking at. It also is one of those things that I think is the quintessential of turning a bad into a good. In economics, we talk about market and non-market goods or values. And market, obviously, prices are determined in the market, but the non-market is the environmental aspect of this. And I think bioenergy is one of those that this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity from a number of reasons. It is turning something that you normally think of as a disposal into the potential to have an economic value. And that, again, going back to the place-based or the locations, is really important in terms of if you look at the agricultural areas within these regions, they have been economically disadvantaged in ways that are very similar perhaps to the energy industries. And so that's one of the places where there's a synergy between. That's a positive. Babs talked about the fact that there is the potential to use brackish water or even produced water from oil and gas. That's another place where that has a synergy across, which is, I think, a huge economic value. In terms of the risk, I think, scale and duration may vary greatly depending upon the project depending upon the source, and that source in terms of the say forest fuel, that can be impacted by climate change. And so I think that's a risk that we have to consider as we go forward. Increased wildfires, things like that, may take out a source very quickly. But that said, I think the array of baths that we have that are the sources, and the fact that you could actually use bioenergy to perhaps reduce the probability of wildfire by cleaning up the forest to some degree, for an example, is one of the things that may be a risk, but it's a huge opportunity as well. And I'll turn it back to you with that.
Thanks, Janie. All right, so Bob, can you discuss the symbiosis between the bioeconomy and the carbon economy? And how do they intersect? And what are some opportunities to create a supply and demand for captured CO2?
Right, there are a number of intersections. As we move to a recycle and carbon removal economy, the bioeconomy will be intimately intertwined with it. Think of this as a long string equation. There are answers that take us to net zero, but they must work together in a balanced solution. If one approach changes up or down, all of the others are impacted. Bio and carbon removal or recycle are in essence one, with a different mechanism. So we must embrace a multifunctional answer. Consider the newly created Harvard Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability. Academia is beginning to look at just how broad the interdisciplinary actions will need to be. Bio and carbon removal economies are dependent on there being regulation, and that is what's going to create demand. We need a bio economy and a carbon utilization economy that can produce valuable products and provide large-scale removal. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, so last question is back to Babs. And so based on your iWest findings, which sectors of the bioeconomy are most promising for the Intermountain West?
Well, Sheila, we focused our studies on production of biopower and electricity or bioethanol in phase 1. Production of electricity from utilization of non-food bio-based feedstocks available in iWest instead of fossil-based feedstocks, as I mentioned earlier, had an impressive 55% reduction in CO2 emissions. The iWest region already has 27 anaerobic digestion facilities, according to the American Biogas Association, and these are located on farms or at wastewater treatment facilities. Anaerobic digestion produces a biogas that can be used locally as a fuel or upgraded to a biomethane or renewable natural gas, which can utilize the existing natural gas infrastructure. So that's one. Nationally, there's a big push now to make sustainable bio-based aviation fuel, or SAF. Aviation is a transportation sector that's difficult to electrify in the near future. And ethanol production from biofeedstocks in the iWest could be used in a jet fuel, for example. The U.S. has a goal to produce 3 billion gallons of SAF per year by 2030. This will be an all-hands-on-deck situation, and the iWest could contribute. There are already 2 emerging SAF producers in Colorado, one using forest waste and another using crop waste. Ethanol is also a commodity chemical and can be converted to low-carbon products, chemicals, or materials such as biodegradable plastics. So we believe that both of these sectors, ethanol production and low-carbon electricity, are promising opportunities for the iWest communities and workforce that can be explored more deeply in phase 2. Back to you, Sheila.
Thanks so much, Bab, and a perfect segue. Thanks for talking about bioenergy economy to my panel. I'd like to hand over to segment 3, which is focused on low carbon electricity, hosted by Adam Mate. Adam?
Thank you, Sheila. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Adam Mate from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I will be leading the discussion on low carbon electricity. Next slide, please. To summarize some key findings from our phase 1 IBEST report, energy is a critical part of who we are. Fossil-based generation is the largest source of electricity across the region. Our high voltage transmission network itself is anchored by large coal-fired power plants, as you can see it in the image on the right side of the slide. We are a major energy exporter to other Western states, and that puts us into a really peculiar position and puts pressure on us to shift our electricity generation towards carbon neutrality. It's unequivocal that the electricity sector must be a critical component of any decarbonization strategy. There are many pathways we can pursue in the future, and my colleagues will be talking about those later in the panel discussion. But just to highlight a couple, we could retrofit natural gas fired plants with technologies to burn fossil fuels blended with hydrogen. We can deploy small modular nuclear reactors to serve as clean baseload generation across the region. We could deploy renewable solar and wind resources that are abundant across the IBEST region, and at the same time adding energy storage capacities. So we have a variety of strategies we can pursue, but we need to move forward. And this is when I will turn to my panel to ask some critical questions. And first to Janie. Janie, based on your analysis of the region, what role does electricity generation currently play in the regional economy, and how does it correlate to CO2 emissions?
Thanks, Adam. I think that's a really good question. Electricity production in the region, I think, is an interesting one. On the one hand, if you look at it just from the perspective of what does generation contribute to the gross state product of each of the states, it's less than 3% in each of the states. So it's very small from that perspective. However, saying that, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Colorado are among the top 10 exporting states of electricity in the country. So it's important and critical in that perspective. Electricity generation is also often coupled with the production of the fuel source. And I think that's the part that we have to think about here as well. That's especially true for coal-fired production, as we've seen in some of the information that Alicia presented or provided in the case study. So we have to look at that as well. And I think as with other energy activities, the economic activity in a community is going to be highly dependent and highly varied. And so the activity at the state level, I think, masks the importance at local levels or at the place-based solution, if you will. So those are pieces we have to consider. Now, specific to CO2, CO2 from generation accounts somewhere between 35 and 45% of the CO2 emissions in each of these states. And so that's substantial. However, I think what we're also seeing is policies within the states, especially things like reducing CO2, renewable energy, has already started to have an impact in terms of the CO2 emissions. So we're starting to see that because it's low-hanging fruit, quite frankly, in terms of being able to reduce the CO2. That said, I think you also are seeing the other piece of this, and I'm going to refer back to Alicia's case study that she showed, that if you look at the impact of shuttering coal-fired generation without maybe that forward path of perhaps moving towards carbon capture, use, and sequestration, or moving to natural gas or something else, you can have severe economic impacts on local communities. I think that's one of the things we have to consider, and I'll turn it back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Janie. And I'm turning now to Mary. Mary, one key findings in the phase 1 report was that the region needs a diverse strategy to achieve carbon neutrality. Can you tell us a little bit about why it is so important? What are the risks of not having a diverse strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think, the same principle that applies to when we invest our money is the same principle that we need to follow when we're generating electricity, and that is you need to have a diverse portfolio of generating technologies. It's foolish to put all your money into one stock, and when that stock tanks, you lose everything. And likewise, it's foolish to rely on just one renewable technology to generate electricity, because they can all fail. We know that wind turbines will freeze in extreme cold winter storms. Solar production decreases on cloudy days. Hydropower dams are vulnerable to drought, as we found out. Hoover Dam produced significantly less electricity due to the water level declines from drought. Utility scale batteries, which although relatively new on the scene, they're likely vulnerable to extreme heat. Natural gas wellheads will freeze in extreme cold, and even nuclear, which is not vulnerable to extreme cold or extreme hot, but it is vulnerable to earthquakes. And so we need to diversify the strategy. We need to have a diversified portfolio of generating technologies. And iWest emphasizes the technology pathways that are place-based. So meaning that the location of the renewable resources themselves, the wind is east of the Rockies, the solar is in the southern states, hydro is close to snow melt and runoff. Hopefully, that will drive the diversity of the technology portfolio. And also, with iWest being a significant exporter of electricity to the West, it will be California's demand for renewable electricity that will also drive the deployment of these renewable technologies. So to wrap it up, as everyone has been saying, it's not going to be one single technology that gets us to net zero. It's going to be a range of solutions. Back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Mary. And turning to Ellen. Ellen, could you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that we face with our fragmented grid? How can our states and electric utilities work together to overcome challenges?
Thanks for that question, Adam. So, the region is blessed with ample wind and solar resources, but to make maximum use of those, you have to have an integrated grid. So in areas where the sun isn't shining or the wind's not blowing, you've got plenty of opportunities to wheel electricity in from other places that do. And at the present time, this grid is, as you were saying, Adam, very fractionalized, balkanized. So to give you an example, the regional reliability is currently managed by 38 separate balancing authorities that perform their necessary functions within their respective control areas. And this is compared to the Eastern interconnection, where the majority of the system is managed by only 6 regional transmission organizations that work closely together. So, and in addition to that, a majority of the entities in the non-ISO areas of the Western interconnection transact most of their business through bilateral contracts that operate on an hourly basis, which is pretty crude actually for electricity coordination through the grid, because what you really want is a centralized market on a sub-hourly basis, like on a 15-minute basis, let's say. So there's a long way to go to this very, very high priority solving this high priority problem of integrating the electricity system throughout the Intermountain West. So in order to develop this bulk electric grid that's going to be resilient in the face of an increasingly renewable future for electricity generation, the manner in which the system is planned and operated and the means by which these entities are compensated for the energy and power, ancillary services, and emissions reductions that they provide, that all needs to improve. And, one just practical way to get started on that is to make sure that each of the states has their roadmap, decarbonization roadmap, and that these roadmaps talk about coordination of grid policy with all the other states. So I'm done.
Thank you, Alan. And another key findings in the iWest report centered on the importance of education, particularly at college level. And it briefly came up earlier in this discussion as well. Bob, I'm turning to you now. What are a few opportunities for curriculum development to help prepare the future workforce for careers in low carbon electricity generation. Could you tell us a little bit that?
Thanks, Adam. Good question about education. So academia at all levels has a real opportunity in front of them. Education for the future of climate solutions should be broad-based and consider all aspects of sustainability in our march to net zero. American education is very good at teaching specific skills. Secondary schools, tech schools, colleges, and universities are good at training economists, lawyers, operators, chemists, engineers, and welders. What is missing and will be needed is the universal conceptual understanding of what all of these different specialties will be working on as we head toward a net zero economy and lifestyle. When I've hired for an engineering firm or a construction project, a critical element is, does the applicant understand power generation so that they can step in and go to work? Power generation has been around a long time, so most hires already grasp the basics. No one grasps the big picture of where we are going and what we are about to embark on. That needs to be taught. This is probably not the expected answer. The educational need now, based on our research at ASU, is to create the foundation of an entirely new industry and the starting place to begin educating those who will educate and train the coming workforce. Once again, training and education will be the key to our future growth toward net zero. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you, Bob. And I'm turning back to you, Mary. Looking to the future, what are some of the biggest challenges that the region faces as we aims to incorporate more and more renewable resources into our current electric system?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. One of the big challenges is going to be grid congestion and oversubscription. To get new generation on the system, in the form of solar farms and wind farms, eventually we're going to require new transmission, otherwise bottlenecks will occur. And they're actually already occurring in other parts of the grid, as you can see if you look at the prices of electricity in the California ISO or ERCOT, MISO, or Southwest Power Pool. The I-West region is a net exporter of electricity, and it mostly flows to California's huge load demand. And we do see proposals for east to west transmission lines to help relieve some of that oversubscription on the transmission lines. But that is one challenge. Another big challenge, honestly, is maintaining baseload. This is going to be extremely important for maintaining the frequency of the grid, especially during extreme events, because this is when it really matters. A rapid decrease in generation during an extreme event causes a rapid frequency drop in the grid. ERCOT found this out in the freeze that occurred in February 2021. When the frequency of the grid fell to 59.4 hertz for 4 minutes, and they estimated that if it had stayed there for another 4 minutes, the entire grid would have collapsed. So in this case, redispatch times for your renewables are going to matter quite a lot here. Utility scale grid batteries can be redispatched in milliseconds, which is great. Hydropower takes a few minutes. Natural gas takes tens of minutes. And again, this is important for maintaining the base load and maintaining the frequency of the grid, especially during those extreme events. Another challenge for the I-West region specifically are siting issues around land restrictions. The I-West region has a lot of federal land, state land, national parks, tribal lands, and they all present their own unique challenges when trying to site and build new generation. And then overall, the regulatory environment, I'm talking FERC, NERC, public utility commissions, EPA. While it's not unique to the I-West region, it is a challenge when it takes years to get a new generating plant approved. Also, the initial capital and startup costs, again, not unique to I-West, but it's a challenge, especially in this high interest environment. And finally, I think the main point I'm trying to make here is that the entire grid is going to become more sensitive to extreme events, especially with the added demand of this increased electrification trend that is going on in our heating, our cooling, our transportation, all the while the share of our weather-dependent renewables, I'm talking solar and wind here, become a bigger part of our generating portfolio. So balancing the grid and planning for reserve margins are, especially for extreme events, is going to be a big challenge. Back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Mary. And I'd like to thank my panel, Jeannie Chernak from University of New Mexico, Mary Ewers from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Alan Krupnik from Resources for the Future, and Robert Page from Arizona State University for this truly fascinating discussion. Thank you. And this concludes our segment. And I'd like to hand it over to Babs Marone to talk about our hydrogen economy. Babs, it's you.
Thank you, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Babs Marone from Los Alamos National Laboratory, and it's my pleasure today to moderate the next segment on the hydrogen economy. Today, I'll be in conversation with Raj Sang from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Rania Ehrenfeucht from University of New Mexico, Prashant Sharan from Los Alamos, Alan Krupnik from Resources for the Future, and Michael Heidlich from Los Alamos. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So just to overview some of the key findings of the Phase 1 Hydrogen Economy report, there are abundant natural resources, including natural gas, that make the I-West region ideal for large-scale hydrogen production. And this includes an existing infrastructure and also workforce that could be utilized, which would reduce time and cost to scale up production. And it was exciting to hear a little bit earlier from Alicia Corbell from San Juan College about the new clean hydrogen training program at San Juan College and how current skills in the energy sector could be updated for the hydrogen economy. There are also some opportunities and challenges. The transportation sector, for example, represents an opportunity to create a demand for hydrogen and reduce emissions in the region. And this would include commercial, private vehicles, as well as government fleet vehicles. An assessment of existing and new infrastructure needs for hydrogen production, storage, and transportation is needed. And last but not least, demands of the hydrogen economy on water resources now and in the future, with anticipated climate change impacts, need to be fully addressed. And that includes potential innovations that would allow for use of non-potable water for hydrogen production, so as not to compete with other needs for fresh water in the region. And with that, I'll turn to our participants for some questions. And I'll start with you, Alan. Across the country, mainly, and certainly in the Intermountain West, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen and what are the specific components of the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. What are some of the components of these new laws and that could enable a robust hydrogen economy in the region?
Sure. Well, there are already, as you can see on the iWest website, a bunch of hydrogen projects that have been proposed or are starting up. And these projects could well be eligible for tax credits and to be part of hubs that can be proposed for this region. So I'm going to talk about those. So the hub program, the hydrogen hub program, is $8 billion that will ultimately fund 6 to 10 projects that involve both producers and off-takers, users of hydrogen, of clean hydrogen. And one of those could very well be in the Intermountain West region. They're supposed to be chosen with some idea about regional, different regions of the country having winners. And the big dog in our region here in the Intermountain West is the Western Interstate Hydrogen Hub, or WISH. This includes New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, and Colorado, and has a variety of corporate partners already that are well known in the regions. The Los Alamos here is part of it, as are some of the other labs in the region, like NREL, and some of our partners, universities, part of iWest, are part of WISH. So that's really the big dog, and they probably have a pretty good chance of winning. There's also Arizona and Nevada with the Navajo Nation that put in a proposal called their hub is the Southwest Clean Energy Innovation Network. And then Utah storage sites for CO2 that would be used to produce hydrogen are part of the High Deal LA project being led by California. So that's the hubs, and we'll know more about that in the fall of this year. And then about some of the winners may be by then. There's also 48, what's called 48C. These numbers refer to the IRS tax code. And this doesn't get talked about as much as some of the others, but it's quite a big program. It's $10 billion that can be used for in tax credits for qualifying advanced energy projects. And 4 billion of those have to be allocated to projects located in energy communities. So you could get some help with communities that are going to be in transition. And these include new and retrofit and expanded industrial facilities reducing CO2 or implicitly reducing CO2 by creating blue hydrogen, that is hydrogen created with carbon capture of the emissions, or green hydrogen created through electrolysis or other means. So because of this use of carbon capture, 45Q is an important tax credit that was in the Inflation Reduction Act, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. The one that's appropriate here for hydrogen is called 45V, as in Victor, and that's a program that gives, depending on the carbon intensity on a life cycle basis of the hydrogen that gets produced, the lower the carbon intensity, the more your tax credit. So this is, if you could create green hydrogen, that's called, which is 100% clean hydrogen. Let's say it's hydrogen made from a dedicated solar facility, then more power to you. You get the top tax credit. On the other hand, if you're creating blue hydrogen that may have a far lower carbon intensity, you're going to get a much smaller tax credit. So that's that program. And the big issue there, my last point here, is that the IRS has to issue regulations for how this program actually is going to work. And there's a very big issue on how they will address the trade-off between making the tax credits easy to get in terms of the electricity that's being used, or harder to get, but trying to maximize the CO2 reductions you get from the projects themselves. And that trade-off is a tough one, and many of us who are watching these programs closely are waiting to see how they're going to handle it.
Thank you, Alan, for leading us through that complicated but evolving policy landscape. Let's turn to Raj for the next question. Raj, what, in your opinion, makes the iWest region particularly suitable for hydrogen production?
Yeah, so Babs, if we look at it, iWest has several attributes which make it ideal for sustainable hydrogen production. I'll cover a few of those as we looked at during the phase 1 analysis. So iWest has a vast natural gas resources, which will enable low carbon hydrogen production with integrated carbon capture, as Alan just mentioned. So looking at the numbers, iWest produces roughly 5,000 billion cubic feet of natural gas every year, which roughly equates to like 10 million tons of hydrogen a year. That's a pretty large scale. And so for this low carbon hydrogen production pathway based on natural gas, there is widely available CO2 geological storage options in iWest, so the CO2 can be captured and stored for a long time. And then the second part we look at is we have untapped renewable energy resources in the iWest, mainly like solar energy, especially on the south of the iWest region. So these are untapped, but they can be tapped into to produce electrolysis-based clean hydrogen. So with that, the open landscape of the iWest provides this opportunity to tap into this renewable energy resource for hydrogen production. So overall, these resources make iWest region very attractive for both for the transient hydrogen pathway, that is natural gas derived hydrogen with carbon capture, and then in long run, sustainable hydrogen production using renewable energy via electrolysis. So as Alan already pointed out, there's potentially 3 hydrogen hubs coming up in this region. So these stakeholders are already looking into iWest specific attributes and leverage those as we decarbonize the region.
Thank you, Raj. Prashant, are you there? Are you ready for this next question? And you're welcome to keep your camera on the whole time. So in the final report, you mentioned that the region could become a major exporter of hydrogen by moving forward with a multi-pronged strategy in which hydrogen production evolves over time. What would that look like?
So, yeah, thanks, Bob. As Raj and Alan just mentioned, iWest is a massive producer of natural gas, and in addition, it gets a very significant part of renewable energy. So the renewable energy helps us in driving the electrolysis system, but the problem with the electrolysis system is right now it's very energy intensive, so that's why it makes it very costly. On the other hand, we have got massive natural gas resources, and for blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen with carbon capture, so the 2 components needed is natural gas and carbon capture along with water. And often these carbon capture is done in grade 6 wells, which are often depleted oil wells. So which we have got a lot in iWest. So that can be one of the places where we can start with blue hydrogen. But one of the catch with blue hydrogen is the methane leakage. We have to address the methane leakage. If the methane leakage is greater than 3.5%, there is no point in producing green hydrogen. There is no point in producing blue hydrogen. We are better off directly burning the methane for heating or for electricity in that case. But yeah, the blue hydrogen can act as a bridge between direct methane burning and a green hydrogen, which is very expensive right now, and it can help in transitioning towards the hydrogen economy. And back to Webs.
Thank you, Prashant. Let's turn back to Raj. And Raj, I'd like you to address the water challenge. With water scarcity being a major concern for the region, what are some specific examples of how risks to water resources could be mitigated in hydrogen production?
Yeah, that's a good question, Babs. And water scarcity in iWest has been brought up by the industrial stakeholders and the workshop participants for the hydrogen production workshop. So that's a challenge we have to overcome for large-scale deployment of hydrogen production in the region. So both natural gas and electrolysis hydrogen need high-quality water, so they can operate for long term without undergoing degradation. So how do we support this water need without further straining the scarce water supplies in the iWest region? So 2 options we could tap into. One is currently thermoelectric power generation and gasoline and diesel production. They use significant quantities of water. That water can be used for hydrogen production as we transition away from the fossil fuel based resources. And then the second, in addition to that, we have large alternate water resources, including brackish water, oil and gas produced water, extracted water. or from the CO2 sequestration operation. So these water have varying salinities and organic contents, which make them difficult to be for treatment, but at the same time, their disposal is also very expensive. So investing into treatment of these waters and then using this water for hydrogen production seems like a pathway which we can utilize without using the fresh water supplies of the I-West region. So,
thank you, Raj. And continuing on the water theme, Rania, water usage for energy is tightly coupled to environmental, energy, and social justice priorities. So what are some of the key issues that technology developers need to be aware of as they study hydrogen-related solutions for the I-West region?
Yes, and thank you for this. I mean, first, I do think we need to remember that the stakes are very, very high in our region when we have discussions about water. And so it's important that we don't underestimate them, and we recognize that we're going to need to have discussions and engagement in addition to technological solutions to try to address some of the challenges. All water discussions, including the use of alternative and non-potable water, is going to enter into these ongoing discussions that are about quantity, of course, about quality, about who has claims on the water and visions for that future use. We already have water shortages, and so any potential water already has multiple other claimants who are thinking about it. And we know these challenges are great. The constraints, the legal and regulatory frameworks and challenges alongside these different priorities. And this also includes the situations that many rights holders, many tribal nations have water rights that have not yet been adjudicated. And so ongoing conversations about access to the water. As a result, hydrogen might be a very important energy source and then still not be an obvious priority in many people's minds for even alternative non-potable water use. So the second issue is going to be to recognize that in these discussions about water, interested stakeholders and rights holders are going to extend much beyond local users and regional users. Water has a broad base of interested groups. I mean, of course, local people for any local action, but also people who are focused on watersheds, on downstream species or communities, industry interests, and people already who have lesser water rights have feeling that the effects of the shortages. So the communities of interest are going to be local, national, and sometimes even international, with varied environmental groups, recreationalists, part-time residents, visitors coming to the table for the conversations. And then recognizing, of course, that local land use facilities, pipelines will have local, local interests, and local communities have different interests in water for nearby facilities. But what this speaks to is the need for a multi-pronged approach to robust engagement and partnership building, and including ongoing discussions to consider hydrogen as a fuel source, as a source of energy, the use of water, and the use of alternative water. And in this case, I would say that collaborative governance solutions may be as important as technology development. And that, I will hand it back over to you, Babs.
So I'll turn it over now to, I believe, Selena for the next segment on CO2 management. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, this is Selena again from University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, and I am filling in for Scott Quillinan, who had to unexpectedly be on the road today. So I am going to be moderating this panel on CO2 capture, utilization, and storage. And this will be in conversation with Derek Vicara with National Energy Technology Laboratory, Jim Gadiger from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Alan Krupnick from Resources for the Future, and Bob Page from Arizona State University. So before we get started with that panel discussion, it's my pleasure to go over some of the key findings from our final report. And I'll start by talking about some of our key findings related to capture, starting first with point source capture. So one of the big opportunities is point source capture in the region. 65% of regional CO2 emissions are from point sources. So deploying CO2 capture technology has a big potential to reduce these emissions. There's also opportunities because carbon capture is a net user of water to use produced water, so it doesn't have the water impact that can be treated. And there's also a lot of opportunities for this to be incentivized with 45Q tax credits for carbon capture, as well as direct air capture. So the region has a lot of potential for direct air capture because of our wide open spaces. It does require a lot of space, as well as access to renewable resources. And this is a pretty new technology, so there's still a lot of need to evaluate the infrastructure and siting, as well as collaborating with regional stakeholders. Next slide, please. So moving on to the storage side, we have tremendous potential for carbon storage in the region because of our geology, our unique geology here. And if we're going to be capturing all this carbon with carbon capture as well as direct air capture, we are going to need a way to permanently and safely store it. So again, tax incentives like 45Q can help incentivize that in the region. It will also require transportation infrastructure in the form of pipelines to get the CO2 from the point sources to the storage. So making sure that we're doing plenty of stakeholder engagement while we're building out this infrastructure will be key as well, as will be the certification process to ensure that we're doing storage safely, reliably, and permanently, and to ensure that communities know that it's being done safely, and to qualify for 45Q tax credits. So let's go ahead and move on to our panel discussion. And I'm gonna start here with a question for you, Jim. Based on your iWest findings, what role will point source capture play in a regional strategy to reach carbon neutrality? And more specifically, what role might it have in short-term, medium-term, and long-term scenarios?
Thanks, Selena. Yeah, so point source capture is an existing industrial technology to capture CO2 from flue gas. Flue gas, like the use of fossil fuels for electricity generation and industrial heat. And point source capture can, starting now, make a significant reduction in the regional emissions by capturing the carbon from the flue gas in those industries, and particularly focusing on electricity generation. And by significant there, I mean think of a quarter of emissions, total emissions in the region that can be addressed today. Point source capture can be retrofit to existing facilities, and when that happens, it has minimal impact to the existing electricity generation operations, while adding at the same time a new industrial component, which helps to support a just energy transition, as we've heard. There is significant power use of about 25% of production of electricity by the point source capture industrial plant. But at the same time, the federal tax credits that we've heard about now help provide a pathway to viable economics for point source capture. And that's the short term, addressing emissions today. In the medium to long term, the point source capture pathway can provide a stable baseload for electricity using existing infrastructure, and also using, as they come online, and available new, more efficient fossil electricity technologies. And I'll note the strong connection here to the co-development of the technologies and infrastructure for carbon utilization and storage, which, as we'll hear, is expected to be able to accept the carbon dioxide from point source capture in industry. Thanks, Selena.
Thank you, Jim. Bob, I have a question for you next. The iWest report suggests that creating a supply and demand for captured CO2 would lead to significant new industry in the region. What are some examples, and what do they mean in terms of jobs?
Selena, as Jim just said, with direct capture or source-based capture or direct air capture, There are a lot of new jobs that are going to come out of this. Some of this was mentioned earlier in the transition piece, but basically you're looking at fairly high skilled work, which generally was the case in energy, particularly when you get inside a plant. I've been fortunate to work on design work for both direct air capture and for source capture. And these are fairly sophisticated pieces of equipment, which will mean you've got manufacturing, you've got the work at the site, both the install and operations, ultimately maintenance. And then you have all of the jobs that come around the more sophisticated kind of equipment that these jobs are going to require. So communities will have the opportunity to base the kind of support jobs that we're used to actually in the energy industry. So there are going to be a lot of existing jobs that apply to from the transition, and there'll be actually new jobs when you get into some of the monitoring and the changes in the kind of equipment that's coming. In our research, we've sort of looked at this as more like the beginning of the aerospace industry and the growth of the aerospace industry. If you look at the numbers of what we're going to need to capture, whether it's source or direct air, it's going to be an industry similar to the size of the aerospace industry and somewhat similar in the skill sets and in the breadth of the kind of employment that's going to come with this. So in closing, again, big opportunity here. The region, because it already has existing plants for source capture, because it has that open space that was referred to previously, and we have the ability to sequester the carbon in the ground and in other ways. This is a great opportunity for this region, and if we can get ready and be prepared to be beneficiaries. So thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Jim, I'm going to bounce back to you. I've got a question for you about water. How does water factor into point source capture? And I alluded to this a little bit. What are the risks and opportunities there?
Yeah, of course, water is expected to be a challenging issue for the region as time goes on. And the use for water in this industrial process of capture is about cooling. And in the simplest path, the need for the water in cooling would be on the same scale as the cooling currently used in fossil fuels electricity generation. With planning, the need for water can be limited both by dry cooling approaches in appropriate sites where we have the land and a climate that's good for that sort of use. And it does introduce some additional capital and operational costs to do that, and increased efficiency of new systems approaches. As we've heard a little bit about, the underground storage of CO2 produces water, which could help to offset the water needs of this industry. And as we've heard, that's something we're looking closely at. And but more at a higher level, this question really is about how we prioritize water use, because this isn't off of a scale that we would expect to be able to be feasible. But even when we need to prioritize it particularly in the arid Southwest, overall, the water requirements don't need to be a barrier to adoption of point source capture.
Thank you, Jim. And now I'm going to bounce back to you, Bob.
Again, huh? All right.
Again, yeah. Where does the region currently stand on direct air capture? And what role might direct air capture play in longer term decarbonization strategies?
Right. Well, we're fortunate in the region in that we have an operating DAC unit in Arizona, and we at ASU are tied in to a startup in the East that also has an operating unit. So we have a little bit of experience with DAC and can see where that might be applied within this region. And as we mentioned, space is going to be an issue. Ultimately, the role of DAC will depend on how it competes with the other possibilities. Cost, resources, water use, speed of adoption will all play a role in what technologies we use to achieve net zero. Some engineered capture solution will play a role. We don't know yet. which one, or if we have even been introduced to it yet. Briefly, in conclusion, a student came up with a new idea this past semester based on a NASA experiment from 35 years ago. Completely new approach, base science, but if we can get the student's new idea to work in the lab, which we are currently working toward, it will be a game changer as far as water use for capture. So new ideas keep coming out and popping up that are truly significant, again, if it works. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Derek, I would like to ask you a question about challenges. Your final report indicates that the region has a lot of capacity for storage of CO2. What are some of the challenges that the region still faces?
Yeah, thanks, Selena. First, I'll note that the region currently has around 40 plus projects in operation or in the planning stages for implementing CCS, which is a great indicator that the region has some local familiarity and affinity for the technology in general. Those projects span a mix of small to relatively large scale with different types of sources, but collectively are demonstrating that, CCS is really versatile. It can reduce large volumes of CO2, and that integration of the different value chain components from capture, transport, and storage is really possible. And while those early regional assessments of storage capacities are promising, growth of the technology to utilize those subsurface resources is really expected to be contingent on overcoming some remaining technical and non-technical challenges that to some degree are really interrelated. So to deploy CCS at the necessary rate that aligns with iWest decarbonization timeline, major growth has to happen in the private sector investment. Stakeholders in the region have noted that throughout the phase one process, growth in CCS is expected to be contingent upon reducing challenges pertaining to different kinds of risk. These include having a stable and transparent policy framework in place to support the technology's fruition and reduce actual and perceived investment risk, along with just improving understanding of how CO2 behavior, particularly upon injection into the subsurface, works. So from a policy side, the iWest region in general is fairly progressive as it relates to CCUS. There's a few key policy needs that would facilitate project deployment a little further. And first, I'll say state and federal government assumption of long-term liability, which was mentioned before, for CO2 projects is one example, believed to be needed to dramatically reduce that perceived investment risk and increase private investment towards CCS. That essentially involves the transfer and responsibility of liability of the stored CO2 to the state, typically after a project has had some time in the post-injection period that shows evidence of the plume and pressure to sort of have stabilized to a non-endangerment level. Having that enables operators to both operationally and financially disengage from the project. And certain states in the region are moving the needle forward here, either already having or developing policies regarding long-term liability and stewardship. Secondly, I'll note state primacy has been a big focal point. The EPA is responsible for providing Class 6 injection well permits, which covers injection into saline formations and other storage options. But primacy allows the states to take on responsibility of reviewing applications and granting permits. So given concerns that exist about the potential length of the permitting process, the cost, the complexity of attaining Class 6, primacy, along with commensurate levels of staffing and resourcing to evaluate applications, will be overly critical to help storage projects be developed. In the iWest region, Wyoming, for instance, as you're no stranger to, has already obtained primacy to administer Class 6 under UIC. Primacy is showing early promise in attracting CCS development in states with it, both in iWest and beyond the region. And then other remaining policy-related challenges relate to establishing pore space rights, where the CO2 is actually injected in the subsurface, and specific rules for transferring the title of pore space rights during injection. It was listed as needed. There still remains a lot of uncertainty across the region about pore space ownership topics, as well as other subsurface resources like produced water and minerals. Many states have laws for unitization of pore space, but clarity there will help. And then from a technical side and operational perspective, a remaining challenge is certainly the vast storage capacity and containment resources by identifying what we call shovel-ready sites, which are capable of enabling safe and effective CO2 storage, as well as promoting rapid storage site deployment. So as you can imagine, no two project sites are expected to be the same. The geologic conditions at each are expected to change wildly. So projects that are ongoing in the region, like DOE's Carbon Save and the regional assessment initiatives, are active in the region, providing work that does just that and identifying these storage options. And last, I'll just say, community outreach and education has to remain critical. For instance, early engagement with stakeholders in the community to better educate them on CCS, as well as help them understand and address the concerns with CCS deployment, needs to be a staple pursuit in the low carbon transition for any technology, really. And so in that vein, also identifying, developing, and promoting some early win projects that show that CCS is feasible, is economically, environmentally beneficial, will help limit future roadblocks and gain policy to support. And those 40+ projects I mentioned earlier are great examples of that. So hopefully these summarize some of the critical challenges that are brought up by stakeholders. The report describes many more in detail if interested, but I hope this helps. And Selena, I'll send it back to you.
It was a great summary. Thank you, Derek. Okay, the last question that I have goes to you, Alan, and I want to ask you about the 45Q tax credits and how they changed with the passing of the BIL and the IRA, and what new opportunities were created, and what are some of the potential challenges there?
Sure, thanks, Selena. So, well, there have been at least two previous versions of 45Q, the tax credit for carbon capture, utilization, storage, and direct air capture. The previous version didn't work very well. It was kind of clunky. It wasn't rich enough. There were few applicants, and half of them had to give funds back for reasons that aren't actually that clear. There is a lack of transparency in this program so far. But for this iteration, the subsidy was increased from $50 to $85 a ton of CO2 for CCUS without enhanced oil recovery. And then it went from $35 to $60 if you had enhanced oil recovery. So both of these uses got richer. And with DAC, you get $180 a ton for permanently stored CO2 and $130 a ton for utilized CO2. So that's pretty rich too, although DAC is pretty expensive, a lot more expensive than 180. This program is open-ended, so as many applicants as can qualify, the U.S. government's on the hook to pay these tax credits. So that's kind of good for the technology, maybe not necessarily the tax credit, the American public. Another big change was, you used to have to find a partner who had tax liability to take advantage of the tax credit. But now there's a direct pay option. So you really don't have to find some partner that is only there to capture the tax credit. The clock was reset and lengthened. It was recognized that these projects take a while to get off the ground. So that was good. And smaller projects are now eligible than compared to the previous iteration of 45Q. We're still waiting for the IRS to write these final rules. So, but they already have rules for the other 45Q, so this may not be too difficult. So overall, of course, a tax credit like this is going to increase the likelihood that projects all around the country are going to go forward and be successful. Congress set these terms with industry input. So presumably this is going to lead to many applications for the money. So we already have a lot of As previous speakers have said, we already have a lot of projects in the iWest region that are ongoing or planned, and presumably they'll be able to take advantage of these tax credits and create a real buzz over CO2 capture and storage. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you to each of our panelists for talking with us here today, as well as for all the work that you did in our final report. I am gonna turn it back over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Selena. And again, I'll be pinch hitting for Scott, who couldn't make it today, but really want to start the process of wrapping up today's webinar by talking about what we envision as our next steps moving forward. So next slide, please. So for our proposed phase two framework, we want to continue on the course regarding our place-based approach and our multifaceted focus on economics, policy, workforce, and ESG. We also aim to maintain our focus on the symbiotic economies that we rolled out in phase one, given their importance in our vision for the energy transition roadmap for the Intermountain West region. In phase two, we want to leverage our phase one successes in terms of developing comprehensive energy sector strategies to approach carbon neutrality in the electricity, transportation, and industrial sectors. We also want to go beyond initial phase one focus in the context of technology feasibility studies, looking at techno-economic analyses and life cycle analyses as examples. And then we want to add the layer of climate focus in terms of looking at sort of decadal impacts of climate and sort of the influence on water availability, given that water availability is a concern that resonates across the entire iWest region. So next slide, please. So in addition to the topics that I just mentioned, we have more work to do in terms of expanding our regional relationships. We really are interested in increasing our engagement with sovereign nations. We want to add new regional college and university partners and leverage capabilities and expertise at other national labs. We also want to explore other technology pathways that we didn't have time to explore in phase one. So with emphasis on renewables as well as nuclear power and its impact potential for the iWest region. And I think a key emphasis for what we'd like to take on in phase two is the rollout of case studies, where we're really shifting away from our phase one focus on assessment to application to really help communities make informed energy transition decisions. And sub-region analyses, to assist communities in energy planning is really the objective here. And we want to exert a much higher degree of integration, again, in terms of looking at policy, economics, and ESG studies and how they sort of overlap with our technology pathways. So next slide, please. And I think with that, we're nearing the end of our webinar. I'd like to turn it over to Melissa Fox for any final words.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And I want to say a big thanks to the entire iWest team for this great discussion today and all the great work that you shared today that led to this. I'd like to also thank our Department of Energy sponsors from the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Office, as well as the Bioenergy Office, especially stakeholders, especially with us through the numerous workshops and seminars and listening sessions you all really helped us to get to the point that we are today. And I think we have laid some really good groundwork here for efforts that can inform energy transition in this region. But obviously there's still a lot of work to be done. And we hope to continue to work with all of you and the other stakeholders who aren't here today and hear from you more as we move forward. And so I think Kevin mentioned earlier, we would really love to get additional questions or comments from you all. We have an email set up, iwest.lanl.gov, and we will do our best to get or iwest@lanl.gov, sorry. We'll do our best to get responses out to you as quickly as possible. We'll get those to the team and get them answered. And so with that, I think I will just wrap us up today, and thanks team for keeping us on time as well. And thank all of the participants who participated today for sharing your valuable time with us, as we really appreciate that. So with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day.